Hi, and welcome once again to Front Row, the movie world's video magazine. I'm Rich Scrivani. And here's a little quiz. See if you can tell me what each of these films have in common. Okay, The Robe, How the West Was Won, Manhattan, The King and I, and It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. Now, if you said they're all in color, you're wrong. I slipped in one black and white title, Manhattan, to throw you. The answer is all of them were filmed in some kind of a widescreen process. Now, on your home video system, you'd only be able to see the entire image in what we call letterboxing. Now, there have been dozens of widescreen formats developed over the years, and today we're going to discuss some of them with our guest, Scott Marshall, editor and publisher of Wide Gauge, a newsletter devoted to the preservation and resurrection of the widescreen movie experience. I think you're really going to enjoy this edition of Front Row.
It is the first public demonstration of an entirely new medium, which we believe is going to revolutionize the technique of motion picture storytelling. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Cinerama.
Welcome to Front Row, Scott.
Thank you.
First of all, Scott is the publisher and editor of a magazine by the name of Wide Gauge. You can get it by subscription only, and we'll find out later exactly how you can send for this. And it's a very interesting magazine. First of all, how did you get involved with this magazine? What got you to the point of wanting to publish a magazine like this?
Well, I had the ideas about widescreen movies and memories of how splendid they were in the 1960s. Sort of in the back of my mind. And then when Bob Harris started restoring some of these old movies like Lawrence of Arabia and Spartacus, I realized that my memories were valid, that these movies were really good. It wasn't just sort of colored by past memories. I brought my son to see Spartacus in New York in 70 millimeter, and the picture was just so astonishing. The sound was so beautiful, and the movie was so powerful on the huge screen with a clear picture. I realized that my memories were still good. I remembered something that was real and good and that's important for the future. And I started talking to my friends about it, researching it, studying widescreen movies, and I realized that it was endless. That I could research it, think about it, talk about it forever, and people actually seem to enjoy listening to me talk about it. So I came up with the idea of publishing a magazine about it.
I attended the same, I think it was at the Ziegfeld,
Yes.
Lawrence of Arabia, and I remember getting about half an hour into it and saying, you know, Peter O'Toole looks pretty darn good for his age, and it hit me. I said, I'm watching a film from 1962. Mm-hmm. That's how good this film looked in its full glory up there. To get back to the beginning of all this, how it all started. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Wasn't it Michael Todd? Wasn't he involved with the first pioneering of the widescreen system, or was the first one Cinerama or Cinemascope? Or
Yeah, to me, everything began really with Cinerama. That's kind of the yardstick against which all other widescreen processes are compared. And Mike Todd was brought in to help out with marketing of Cinerama and promoting it.
What year are we talking about?
We're talking about 1951 and 52.
So that predates Cinemascope by like 2 years.
It sure does.
Right? Okay.
Mm-hmm. And Mike Todd was inspired by the magnificence of Cinerama with the widescreen, the immersive cinema experience. But he didn't get along personally with the other people at the Cinerama company. So right around the time when This is Cinerama released in 1952, he quit the Cinerama company and began building a competitive system, which he was going to call Todd-AO. His specification was to make Cinerama out of one whole, because a complaint about Cinerama was that it required 3 projectors on the screen and had a separate sound tape. And it was very expensive and kind of messy to display, to show a Cinerama movie. He said, yeah, he said, let's put it all in one film. And he called it Todd-AO for his name, Mike Todd, and AO stands for the American Optical Company that they developed the lenses, built the cameras.
Yeah.
And his contribution was to come up with the 70 millimeter format that became dominant. Is probably the best storytelling widescreen or cinema method is Todd-AO 70 millimeter.
Now, was the first Todd-AO film Oklahoma?
Oklahoma, yes.
Yeah, that was 55?
That's right.
50. So Cinemascope had gotten a jump on this, right?
Yes.
53.
Yes,
correct?
Cinemascope was developed virtually in the month after Cinerama came out, because the movie industry was worried because television was taking so much of its audience away, and it needed to do something that television couldn't do. And Cinerama started the widescreen revolution. It was kind of ground zero of the whole widescreen explosion. And immediately the studios jumped to come up with their own widescreen systems. And Cinemascope was the first one. They began to develop it only a month or 2 after Cinerama came out.
Mm-hmm.
And a year later they premiered with the movie The Robe in Cinemascope. They had 4-track sound against Cinerama's 7-track sound. And
Yeah.
they had a screen almost as wide but not nearly as curved. And people actually used to call Cinemascope the poor man's Cinerama. And it's a terrific technology. The Cinemascope anamorphic widescreen films are wonderful, and we know them today as Panavision. And about 1/3 of all movies today are still made in that format that originally was called the poor man's Cinerama.
Yeah, and Panavision, that's just a brand name?
Pretty
it's
much.
Really still the same lenses that they use, the same?
Well, they keep
Squeezed.
improving them over the years, but it is essentially the same formula as Cinemascope.
For anybody who's not really too familiar with this, the picture is squeezed. It's shot with an anamorphic lens and then brought out with an anamorphic lens. Am I right? Mm-hmm. And it unsqueezes the picture, so you get a nice wide shot. So that if you were to screen the original strip of film that was originally developed, you'd get everybody looking like they're in a funhouse mirror. But now, one thing I was curious about, I'd seen films, Cinemascope 55 shortly after that.
Yes.
And I thought, well, what is this? Because it's 1955, now they're calling it Cinemascope 55, but it was a new process, right?
Apparently it had nothing to do with the year 1955. It was the format was chosen because they ended up with film stock that was 55 millimeters wide. And it's kind of unfortunate that it came out in the same year, because I think people did believe that it was a 1955 format, but the movies came out in 1956, so people might have thought it was something like last year's model car, and it was not good anymore. But one of the problems with Cinemascope was that the pictures were not very clear. It was a very small image on film that they blew up to a very, very large screen. And although that was impressive, it was kind of a blurry picture. And Fox decided, well, they realized that if you put a huge piece of film in the camera, you could photograph a very, very sharp picture. And then when that was reduced in size to a normal release print, a lot of that sharpness was retained. So Cinemascope 55 was an attempt to get closer to Cinerama by coming out with some of the image clarity that Cinerama had with its 3 pieces of film.
And according to one of your articles in Wide Gauge, hardly anybody ever got to see the real quality of Cinemascope 55. They never really released prints was that correct? They didn't really...
It's apparently they never showed it from actual 55 millimeter film. It looked better in 35 millimeter than ordinary Cinemascope did,
Yeah.
but not enough of a difference to really, for most audiences, to notice.
So how long did that format stay in existence, or is it?
Not long at all. They made Carousel with it, the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical. And then they made The King and I, and Carousel was a commercial failure. It's not a very bad movie, but it's certainly not one of the best movies, movie musicals. For some reason, it flopped at the box office, and that actually hurt the format. That's the funny thing is that about formats is that they get connected with movies. If a format gets connected with a very successful movie, people think that format is successful, and they really don't have that much to do with each other. Carousel was a box office failure, and that gave Cinemascope 55 an image of being a failure as a technology. But the second movie that they started filming even before Carousel came out was The King and I, which is a tremendous movie. It's a huge hit.
Big success, yeah.
Very popular even today.
And it's still, they didn't go, how much further did they go with that process? Did they do, did Fox do many more movies in that process?
Well, that was it. They, a year or two after King and I came out, they filmed a travelogue called Deluxe Tour. And that apparently was a demo that was, and they had hoped actually to sell Cinemascope 55 to the Cinerama company as a single lens Cinerama to stop using the 3 strips, but it still couldn't compete. It wasn't as sharp or clear or as wide as the Cinerama process.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the end of Cinemascope 55. But it was a tremendous process. It potentially could have done very well.
Yeah, shame. I would love to see what it really was supposed to look like. Now, my first memory of seeing as a kid, I was about 18. When I went to see a film called It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. And all my friends were saying, it's Cinerama, but there are no more lines. You know, it's a big picture, but there are no lines. And How the West was one, which had just preceded that, which was also a wonderful film, I thought, did have the three different projectors. Now, was Mad World, what was the process for Mad World? Was that Ultra?
Mad World was shot in Ultra Panavision 70, which is essentially the same as Todd-AO 70 millimeter, except they have a little bit of a squeeze to the lens, a little bit of anamorphic. So if you look at the 70 millimeter film for Mad Mad World, people are just a little bit skinny.
Mm-hmm. So in other words, I believe, now, correct me if I'm wrong about this too, the squeeze was on the sides? The
yes,
very ends?
Well, the camera didn't do that. The camera made an ordinary Ultra Panavision print, just like Ben-Hur, which was camera 65, and a few other movies made in Ultra Panavision. But when they made a release print, and they called it Cinerama, what that meant was they were going to show the film on a deeply curved Cinerama screen, which is curved like that. And part of what they did to make it look okay on the curved screen was to squeeze the sides of the image so that when they stretched out on the sides of the screen,
compensate for the curve.
Mm-hmm.
You have a couple of strips. I don't know how well we can see them, but I'd like to see, so we can illustrate. This is
right up.
an outtake, right?
Yeah, this is one of the earliest pieces of Todd-AO film. It's actually 65 millimeters instead of 70 millimeters because they hadn't started putting the soundtrack on the edges of the film yet. This is an outtake from Oklahoma, part of the work print that they used. This is from 1965.
Yeah.
And it's terribly faded, as most Eastman color movies from the 50s are. It looks purple.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happens to movies that aren't stored in a refrigerator if they're filmed that way. And that's part of the tragedy of 70 millimeter, is that they were filmed on a kind of color of film stock that fades. They couldn't use Technicolor, which doesn't fade. And a lot of the great, magnificent films of that era are fading away. They're disappearing, and that's why the restorations are so important now.
Yeah, so they couldn't do the 3-strip color process, the 3 different negatives that they used to use for original Technicolor. It was too expensive for that size film.
It was never implemented for 70 millimeter, and exactly why it was a business decision of Technicolor Corporation, never to build the equipment to do that.
Yeah. Also, are there any theaters left that can show Ultra Panavision? Is there anywhere we could see that?
There are a few, and they're at the museum in Bradford, England, the Pictureville Cinema. They can show Ultra Panavision. There's a screening room at the Panavision company where they have maintained the equipment to show Ultra Panavision as well.
And that's it? Nothing in this country?
I don't know of anyone, but the lenses are there. Collectors have the lenses. Projectionists sometimes keep them handy, and just in case there's a new release in Ultra Panavision, they can stick those on the projector and we can go. But there are also hardly any screens that are that wide. The Ultra Panavision screen is almost 3 times as wide as it is high. It's like this, and they just don't make screens that big anymore.
Yeah, that's it's amazing. Somebody my age who had seen all of that from the 50s on up. I get very frustrated when I go to a movie and I can't tell whether they have one size screen for everything. And some of these things are at least shot anamorphically, and you're sitting there watching a sort of a compromised picture. And
That's right.
I think people ought to be heard, get up in arms of people who care to bring back the proper presentation of these widescreen pictures, because they're really showing a one screen fits all type of thing.
That's right.
Have there been very many pictures have been filmed in a widescreen process, and it turns out that there are only merits with that they were widescreen, but that the films weren't very good?
Well, it's a lot of the later films in Super Panavision and Todd-AO were exactly like that. By the way, Super Panavision and Todd-AO are basically the same format with different brand names. Ultra Panavision is the stretched and squeezed Super Panavision. But films at the end like Star and The Last Valley, at the end of the widescreen revolution, which is 1970, didn't do especially well at the box office. They weren't critical or box office successes.
2 just jumped into my mind. Krakatoa East of Java, would that be one?
That was a famous bad movie, yes.
And something called Custer of the West. How was that? What process was that in? Was that Ultra Panavision?
I think that was a Technirama picture. I would have to go back to my notes. I don't remember exactly. But Technirama is quite similar in image clarity and potential screen size as 70 millimeter. Now,
I want to talk just briefly about what they tried to do with Gone with the Wind. Back,
Yes.
when was it, in the 70s? I can't recall the exact year, but when they tried to make it a widescreen presentation.
Yeah, well, Gone with the Wind being a perennial film to re-release in theaters, they wanted to bring it back once again in the middle of the widescreen revolution, and films like Gone with the Wind, which were shot in the Academy frame, which is the same as a television picture size, looked kind of old-fashioned next to the widescreen movies of the day, and so the studios thought, well, we got to do something to spark it up, make it look new again, and they decided to make it into a widescreen movie, and all they did essentially was crop the top and bottom of the picture, or if there was action at the top of the picture, they would actually scroll it up or down, so that we would not miss, a face in the picture that we had to see, and they also stretched out the sound. It was a mono soundtrack, and they sort of added some echo and panning to make it into a stereo movie. But at that time, it was still a box office draw to be able to advertise in 70 millimeter.
Yeah.
And they believed that would bring more people into the theater.
There's a fellow up in Ohio I want to touch on. I believe you've been there. I think his name is John HARVEY.
Yes.
Who has brought back Cinerama. He has his own. Didn't start in his home. He had this equipment, and he had his home adapted to show Cinerama. And you can tell me the rest. What he's doing now.
Yeah, he's running Cinerama movies, authentic 3-panel films just like they used to be in the run in the 50s and 60s in a theater in Dayton, and they have a weekend showing every month of a Saturday at 1 o'clock matinee. They usually have How the West Was Won or This is Cinerama, the first Cinerama movie. They're also showing Cinerama Holiday and Seven Wonders of the World. And John Harvey has been able to collect and restore, maintain, and present Cinerama films just like they used to be. And they are just wonderful shows. I recommend them to everyone.
Your attention, please. You've never had an experience like this. You become an actual part of every thrilling historic moment in How the West Was Won. The magic of Cinerama puts you right in the middle of every exciting scene, every bold adventure. You join in every spectacular action thrill. Share the lusty old West fun as you live, love, fight, adventure, side by side with these great stars. Carol Baker, Lee J. Cobb, Henry Fonda, Carolyn Jones, Carl Malden, Gregory Peck, George Peppard, Robert Preston, Debbie Reynolds, James Stewart, Eli Wallach, John Wayne, Richard Widmark, co-starring Bridget Baslin, Walter Brennan, David Bryan, Andy Devine, Raymond Massey, Agnes Moorehead, Henry Morgan, Thelma Ritter, Mickey Shaughnessy, Russ Tamblyn. Three great directors, Henry Hathaway, John Ford, George Marshall. Narrated by Spencer Tracy. How the West Was Won, an entertainment miracle that includes you.
And you just got back recently from this Widescreen Film Festival?
In Long Beach, California, at the at Cal State University there, they have a wonderful theater, the Karen Carpenter Center, and this is their third annual Widescreen Film Festival. It takes place over 3 weekends. They have lectures from cinematographers and editors and directors and producers. And for the third festival, they learned of my reputation through the Wide Gauge magazine, and they asked me to participate, to help review their publicity materials. And
were you the one who advised them to do the big trail? This is something I want to get into also.
I don't remember suggesting that, but it was a good choice because that's one of the first large format 70mm movies ever made. 1930
John Wayne film in widescreen, and you can tell us more about how they were able to do that in 1930. I think it's amazing.
Well, they developed a format called Grandeur. The Mitchell Camera Company made the first 70mm projectors, and these were not 65mm like Todd-AO. They were real 70mm, and the film was huge. It was pretty much the same as a normal movie made in those days, except it had twice as much image space and width, and the screen aspect ratio is exactly twice as wide as it is high, and it looks very much like one of today's widescreen Panavision movies.
Amazing. I would love to see that. Did they use the camera? Were they able to move the camera much? I mean, they didn't have the mobility that they had later on that made widescreen movies come alive, you know, dollying and cranes and stuff like that. Were they able to do much
a little bit? Actually, the camera moves, the pans and tilts were rather clumsy looking, unfortunately. They didn't have smooth movement. But they did it one of the things about the large formats is you don't need to pan and tilt the camera very much because you move the camera back, you pick up lots of action, and everybody is clear and sharp, and you can arrange all the different characters across the screen. And the audience, following the action, watching who's talking, does their own panning and tilting.
I wanted to go into some of the other widescreen processes. God knows there's how many of them. I don't know.
There are about a half a dozen important ones, but there are maybe 100 processes if
different
you
names.
want to list them all. Yeah.
Well, let's take Cinemiracle, which I believe the movie Windjammer was filmed in. What?
Cinemiracle is really the same as Cinerama, except they had to avoid patent infringement, and they changed all kinds of little details in the technology so that they wouldn't get sued for infringing the patents. Otherwise, it's basically the same as Cinerama.
Oh, okay. Because I couldn't see any difference, and I saw Windjammer when it was first out. VistaVision.
VistaVision was Paramount's answer to Cinerama to get a larger, sharper, clearer, brighter picture on the screen. And they ran the film horizontally instead of vertically so that they could get a bigger picture in the camera.
Then they have to develop new new cameras and projectors to run something like that?
Well, eventually they did. The first camera they used to film VistaVision was an ancient color camera that photographed 2 frames, one on top of the other, and they just turned it sideways and made White Christmas with it.
And that was the first was that the first VistaVision?
Yes.
White Christmas?
Yes.
Basically Paramount owned that, didn't it?
That's correct.
Yeah. So, because as a kid, I have to be honest, I used to see VistaVision films and didn't know because I was aware of Cinemascope, but I wasn't all that aware of what was going on with VistaVision, except it told you it was in, Big V would come out, actually. But
I want to see another film with that Big V in the
I used to love it
beginning.
because it would get my attention. So this is going to be a special thing.
Yeah. Well, they were. I don't think I ever saw a VistaVision film when I was young and knew that that's what it was. But the picture should have looked a bit sharper and less grainy than a normal movie.
Superscope. The heck is that? I don't mean to belittle any. I'm just saying, is Superscope a true anamorphic?
Well, in the camera,
widescreen?
they shoot on normal film, kind of in the normal way, but they have a different viewfinder markings. It's called the ground glass. When the cameraman looks through the camera, he sees special markings that show him a widescreen area, so he tries to ignore the picture above and below that.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And then when they make a release print from that, they put it into an optical printer and they do the stretching so that the final print actually is about the same as a Cinemascope print.
So the cinematographer has to have a good eye for composition using that. Oh, they don't use it anymore. Sure.
Well, actually there's a format now called Super 35, which is very popular. And about half of the widescreen movies today are made in Super 35. So the camera is shooting an ordinary movie. In fact, they use more of the film where the soundtrack used to be.
I see.
And then they squeeze that into a print that's the same as a Panavision print, essentially.
Hi, this is Brink Stevens, and you're watching Front Row.
35 millimeter, 16 millimeter. I think I have a new appreciation for the work that went into all those big pictures when Hollywood was trying to lure us away from our TV sets and back into the theaters. Whether it was Cinemascope, Ultra Panavision, or Cinerama, the showmanship involved with widescreen presentations were what once made moviegoing not just a night out, but a special event. It seems like we've lost some of that magic today, but maybe people like Scott Marshall and John Harvey will help awaken new interest in the way movies should be presented. Here's hoping, and join us next time on Front Row.
I want to see another film with that Big V.
Yeah.